This week on the APUSHow, we're looking at Chapter 28, The Affluent Society. We'll take a look at the economic miracle. I wonder if it was as miraculous as my tax returns this year, because I did not expect to get a refund, but I did. No, you're not getting any of them. We'll look at the explosion of science and technology. I thought all the exploding of science and technology happened in World War II. Would there be more? I guess we shall see. We'll look at the people of plenty. I hear there were plenty of people also created in the 1950s. And this plenty of people had plenty of things, and that seems like plenty of a good time. But we'll also look at the other America. I guess plenty of people also didn't have plenty, and I wonder what their life was like. Probably not great. We'll look at the rise of the civil rights movement. A lot of people like to think the civil rights movement is a 1960s thing, but we'll see the 1950s had plenty of folks who were a little sick and tired of this whole segregation and oppression thing. We'll look at Eisenhower republicanism. After years and decades of Democratic dominance, Eisenhower's Republicans would sweep the White House and also for a brief period of time, the Congress. How would that go? Would it go well, or would it go a little tumultuously? Lastly, we'll look at Eisenhower, Dulles, and the Cold War, and we'll see that there wasn't a whole lot of Dulles moments during Eisenhower and the Cold War. All this and more this week on the APUSHow. Our discussion of the so-called economic miracle of the 1950s. And to be fair, it was fairly miraculous as Americans experienced greater prosperity than ever before with a higher degree of distribution, especially compared with the previous period of affluence, the 1920s. But as we'll see in this chapter, that prosperity wasn't as shared and widely distributed as many people would think, or even as much as William Howard Taft might think. Well, I'd say that's a pretty reckless attitude, Taft. Wow. After all the progress we made with the restorative justice sessions. Between 1945 and 1960, the United States saw massive improvements in terms of overall gross national product numbers, as well as its unemployment numbers. More and more Americans than ever before were able to find work and were producing more and more goods of high and consistent value. Not only would gross national product rise by 250%, inflation would remain relatively low at less than 3%. And how did the United States do it? Well, there were essentially three sources for this growth: government spending, the baby boom, and suburban growth. As you may remember from Chapter 26 on World War II, the massive government spending in World War II is what effectively ended the Great Depression. Though the United States government spent a great deal less after World War II, it still spent a lot as federal, state, and local governments would help fund public schools, housing, veterans benefits, a new massive highway system, and of course, the biggest of all, the military, especially during the Korean War. In addition to government spending, economic growth was also fueled by a huge population increase at the time known as the baby boom. Between World War II and the late 1950s, the American population increased by nearly 20%, mostly due to the birth rate. Soldiers returning from war looking to start a family and Americans feeling more confident in their ability to start a family both would lead to this boom, and the increase in children would help fuel demand for consumer spending as kids are insanely expensive and need things. Even more expensive than cats. And lastly, you had huge suburban growth at this time. We'll talk a bit more about the suburbs later, but within the context of economic growth, you had a huge amount of people moving to the suburbs outside of the city, and with new housing, the need for cars, as most suburbs required cars in order to function, these would also lead to economic growth. But realize that economic growth has a great deal of benefit for people. It is by no means perfect, and economic growth almost always has large amounts of unintended consequences as well. As far as regional growth at this time, no region saw a greater degree of growth in the 1950s than the American West. Before World War II, the West had always been sort of an appendage or colony of Eastern business ventures, but after the war and the massive amount of improvements to infrastructure in the region, the West became its own independent center of industry and culture. Military spending and contracts flowed heavily to the West. Research would emerge from the region as state universities in Texas and California would grow and proliferate. And the favorable warm climate would entice a huge migratory shift as people would flock out west at the prospect of warmth and prosperity. I mean, who doesn't want to be warm and rich, Taft? The huge shift in the power of the American economy would also lead to an incredibly confident tone within American politics. A great deal of this confidence came from not only the degree of affluence that came with this period, but also from two sources. One of which was the application of the economic theories of John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was a world-renowned and somewhat openly bisexual British economist who espoused a type of macroeconomic theory that emphasized the need for demand-minded government economic policies. Basically, what that means is that he advocated that the government needed to take an active role in economic policy to help the good economic times stick around as long as possible and the bad economic times to be as minimal and short as possible. This means the government has to alter its spending, taxation, and how it manages the money supply depending on the health of the economy. Well, the last years of the Depression and World War II seemed to confirm Keynes's theories in the eyes of many Americans, not just economists. The theory made business leaders happy in that it didn't necessarily call for wealth redistribution in hard times, but rather increase spending in order to spur economic growth. But as we examine capital and labor, we see the post-war period as a period of large organization and consolidation. Nearly 4,000 corporate mergers occurred in the 1950s, more than ever before. A big part of that consolidation was the practice of the federal government only allowing government contracts to go to large corporations. For example, in 1959, over half of all defense contracts went to only 20 companies. However, this was disastrous for many small businesses and small family-style farms, as the sheer size and scale of big business proved insurmountable to these smaller ventures. And as far as labor goes, consolidation would also be the name of the game, as the two longtime rival unions, the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, better known as the AFL and the CIO, would join together to form one nationwide network of unions, the AFL-CIO, which still functions today and of which I am a member. Taft, how does it feel to live in a proud union home? Darn right it does. A big reason why the AFL-CIO merger was made possible was because of the massive efforts from labor leaders dating all the way back to the Knights of Labor Days, the huge gains made during the Great Depression and World War II, and also because of the post-war contract. The post-war contract was the relationship between labor unions and employers, which effectively meant that workers would get continued increases in wages and benefits as long as they didn't strike on other issues like production plans and workplace control. As a result, union workers received ample compensation during this time, and strikes were very infrequent. However, union prosperity also bred corruption, as scandals involving the truckers' union known as the Teamsters, as well as the United Mine Workers, would land national labor leaders like Jimmy Hoffa, Tony Boyle, and David Beck, among others, to wind up either investigated by the government for malfeasance, incarcerated, or in the case of Jimmy Hoffa, so involved with the mafia that he simply disappeared. Taft, do you know where Jimmy Hoffa is? I don't think he's in that book at all. However, because of Taft-Hartley, which severely limited a union's ability to grow thanks to the abolition of the closed shop and establishment of right-to-work laws, which meant people didn't have to join unions, small unions suffered as unorganized workers would experience smaller wages and fewer benefits compared to unionized workers. As a result, union membership would flatline during the 1950s, and union attempts to increase membership would largely fail for nearly 30 years after World War II. In addition to the economic miracle, we'll also see that there were numerous other miracles in terms of science and technology in the years following World War II. In this period, we'll see that humans expanded their ability to explore the vast reaches of space, their ability to expand the life of humanity itself, but also the ability to perhaps end humanity itself. Numerous medical breakthroughs during this period dramatically prolonged human life, as certain diseases were effectively eliminated thanks to science. Building off of the breakthroughs of Louis Pasteur and Jules-François Joubert in the 1870s, scientists in the 1930s were able to develop antibiotics which helped to eliminate many of the worst effects of streptococcal blood infections. So basically, your chances of dying of strep or strep-like diseases dramatically decreased. Similarly, penicillin would be discovered earlier in 1928, but wouldn't find its immensely useful application against bacterial infection until the 1940s, as researchers at Oxford were able to produce it for mass scale. By the 1950s, nearly every doctor's office and hospital in the world had access to penicillin for its patients. The 1950s would also witness the development of the polio vaccine, thanks to a team of researchers led by Jonas Salk. Polio was a debilitating virus that killed and crippled thousands of children and adults, including President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But thanks to Salk and his team, polio had essentially been eradicated thanks to its vaccine. And just as medical researchers were curing all sorts of diseases, other scientists were also resolving issues regarding insect infestation that led to human disease and crop destruction. The development of a chemical known as dichlorophenyltrichloroethane. Dichlorodiphenyltrichloroethane. Boom, nailed it. Also known as DDT, it was proven to be extremely toxic to insects but seemingly harmless to humans. However, it was discovered decades later, after it was sprayed all over plants and crops for years, that it did have long-term toxic consequences for human beings. There were also huge innovations in electronic technology, in particular television and computers. The first televisions had been developed for commercial use in the 1940s, and by the late 1950s, color televisions were invented. Transistors would also be developed, which helped miniaturize necessary technology needed for television, radio, audio, satellite technology, and many others. It would also help to spur the development of complex circuit boards, which would be absolutely essential for the development of computers. The first computers were massive machines that took up whole rooms and floors and were predominantly used to transfer and break military codes. Powered by vacuum tubes, the technology was incredibly innovative at the time, but also completely impractical for commercial use. With the invention of transistors, that all began to change in the 1950s as computing found greater appeal and use. The Universal Automatic Computer, or UNIVAC, would be the first significant computer developed. Initially used for the Bureau of the Census, the UNIVAC would gain popularity when it was used to accurately predict the results of the 1952 election on CBS television news. In the mid-1950s, the International Business Machines Company, or IBM, would begin to develop and introduce its first data processing computers for business. Thanks to its commitment to research and development, IBM would be a worldwide leader in computer technology for decades. But in true human form, our capacity to prolong precious human life, along with our capacity to make human life more enjoyable through technology, were both matched by our capacity to promptly end human life. In the 1950s, American researchers were able to develop bombs, rockets, and missiles that would help us defend ourselves and attack our enemies, especially the Soviet Union, to the point of near annihilation of every human on the planet. The development of the hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb, allowed the United States to create an explosion many times greater than the nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Along with the development of bombs came the need to develop technology to transport said bombs to their necessary target. This is where rocket and missile technology come into play. And by the way, the difference between a rocket and a missile is that a rocket is an engine-propelled vehicle that travels through the air at high speeds, whereas a missile is an engine-propelled vehicle that travels through the air at high speeds, but with a weapon attached to it. No, Taft, you don't have a rocket engine. Thanks in large part to German scientists who migrated to the United States during and shortly after World War II, the United States was able to develop rockets and missiles that could be deployed at a moment's notice and deliver a hydrogen bomb explosion to a target thousands of miles away. Our ability to completely annihilate an enemy, ourselves, and the whole world was potentially not very far off. But rockets were not only developed to bring the threat of nuclear extinction to the human race, they also were developed to help humans begin to explore beyond planet Earth. The Cold War developed an intense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, which caused the two countries to not only compete in terms of military and geopolitical aspects, but in almost every other facet of human life, including space exploration. Americans were on the verge of panic when the Soviet Union successfully launched Sputnik, the first unmanned spacecraft into orbit in 1957. This would spur the United States to rapidly increase its own space exploration capabilities as huge investments and commitments to improving science and technology education would be taken. The United States would then send its own unmanned spacecraft, Explorer 1, into orbit in 1958. That same year, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, would be established. The United States would also send its first man to outer space in Alan Shepard, but again, it was months after the Soviets sent their own Yuri Gagarin into space. The United States sought to quote-unquote win the space race by successfully putting a man on the moon. The program to put a man on the moon was the Apollo program, which got off to a horrific and tragic start in that the first 3 astronauts of the Apollo program died in a fire. However, the 11th Apollo missile launch saw the United States land the first and second men on the moon in Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin in 1969. This was a huge win in the eyes for many Americans because it was done before the Soviet Union. But apart from pride, space exploration would prove to be massively important to help develop our understanding of the universe, but also to help implement satellite technologies, as NASA would help to launch and orbit key satellites whose technological aspects are still heavily used to this day. But apart from big changes in terms of the economics, health, and technological capabilities of the United States, there would be massive social changes too. The American middle class would experience a boom like never before, as the American middle class would become more suburbanized, more homogenized, but just as racist as ever before. One of the prevailing themes we see from the 1950s in America, apart from intense hatred towards the Soviet Union, was a dominant consumer culture. Marketing firms would develop the capacity to create demand for all sorts of products as assorted crazes would emerge among American consumers. Whether it was hula hoops, Davy Crockett hats, or Mickey Mouse watches, Americans wanted to buy stuff, and there was no shortage of companies or marketing folks willing to sell said stuff. Apart from buying stuff, Americans would also look to buy homes, as the suburb would also become a major symbol of American 1950s life. But these suburbs would not have been possible without the development of the American highway system and the popularity of the automobile. American car ownership would increase by 400% between 1940 and 1980, and nearly 40,000 miles of highway would be constructed. Thanks to the Federal Highway Act of 1956, Americans could now drive to nearly any corner of the country they wanted. There are also other consequences, as Americans would move to the suburbs now that highways and automobiles allowed them to live further from work, and also parking lots and garages became necessities for many homes and businesses. It's also worth noting that highways would also be used as natural concrete barriers to help further segregate American cities. And speaking of segregation, one of the largest group of Americans to flock to the suburbs would be white Americans. Smaller cities outside of major cities would prop up as suburbs like Levittown, New York, with its promise of open spaces and affordable living spaces, appealed to many Americans. Thanks to the GI Bill, many American veterans were now able to afford housing in the suburbs, whereas before, housing was scarce and unaffordable in the city. However, Americans would also bring their own pre-existing notions of classism and racism to the suburbs, as there would be suburbs for wealthy people, suburbs for middle-class people, and suburbs for lower-middle-class people, just like before in major cities. In addition to this, there are also heavy notions of racism, as certain suburbs created formal and informal mechanisms to segregate themselves, whether it was federal zoning restrictions, mortgage discrimination, racist agreements to segregate among homeowners, or flat-out violence, terror, and hostility. Black people were often excluded from moving to certain suburbs, as well as gaining wealth via home ownership, as racism would again prove to be able to not only sustain itself, but further entrench itself in American society via housing. And as the suburbs provided convenience as well as more entrenched divisions of class and race, it also created more entrenched divisions of gender as well. In short, suburbs had a lot of benefits for white men, but not nearly as many for everybody else, including women. Suburban men typically worked in the city and commuted from home to work, thus creating a sharp separation between home life and professional life, whereas women stayed home to raise their children. Women were increasingly expected to stay at home and stay out of the professional sphere, and many men accepted the notion that a working life was an affront to their own masculinity. In addition to this, you also had changing notions to parenthood, like the philosophy of parenting presented by Dr. Benjamin Spock. Though Dr. Spock would change his views of parentage many times, his initial view of a heavily child-centered approach meant that women were to place all their needs as secondary to their own children. This approach, along with American society's structural aversion to female professionalism, would create a society in which women were expected to provide for their husbands and children first, and themselves second, if at all. What would also bolster yet also weaken Americans' tendency for keeping everyone the same and conform to overarching American norms was the birth of television. The growth of television was explosively rapid, as the amount of television sets in America was numbered at about 17,000 in 1946. But by 1957, there were about 40 million television sets, about one for every family in America. The television industry would emerge right out of the radio industry, as the same companies like ABC, NBC, and CBS would dominate the TV screen. Television money was made the same way as radio, as advertisements in the form of commercials or sponsored television programs. Because of television's popularity, more people would get their news from television as opposed to newspapers. Televised sporting events would become massively popular, as professional and college sports would become big business ventures. But there would also be homogenizing messages in television programs like Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver, which perpetuated an image of implicit understanding of the superiority of the white male figure. This was perhaps most explicitly personified by the program Father Knows Best. However, there were programs that would attempt to present challenges to this system, but almost always in a family-friendly and non-threatening manner. Now, as you may remember from Chapter 22, the 1920s marked the beginning of when middle-class Americans began to gain and accept the idea of paid vacation time. And with that paid vacation time came the idea of travel vacations. In the 1950s, with newfound prosperity for many Americans, travel and recreation became much more popular than ever before. Many Americans would travel throughout the country, oftentimes to outdoor locations, to take advantage of the scenic beauty of the American wilderness and engage in recreational activities like boating, hunting, fishing, and camping. However, this somewhat clashed with the environmentalist idea of preserving natural settings in the wilderness, and the clash between environmentalists and outdoor enthusiasts slash irrigation and infrastructure enthusiasts would come to a head in the battle over Echo Park. Echo Park is a gorgeous outdoor setting that rests on the border between Utah and Colorado. But in the 1950s, the federal government wanted to build a dam that would provide irrigation as well as a man-made lake for boating and recreation. Remembering their defeat at Hetch Hetchy decades earlier, the American environmentalist movement awoke from its slumber to fight the construction at Echo Park. The Sierra Club, which had been quiet in previous decades, sprang into action and fought construction at Echo Park tooth and nail. As a result of their efforts and a lot of public pressure, Congress voted to block the project and preserved Echo Park in its natural state. Taft, you a big Echo Park guy? How on earth did you do that? There would also be further changes in society as more and more people found themselves working for and within large corporations and organizations. As the number of white-collar workers dramatically increased, so did the amount of industrial workers working in large organizations or unions. The need for highly specialized skills within those institutions became more apparent as universities as well as primary and secondary schools would respond accordingly. Greater emphases would be placed on foreign language, mathematics, sciences, as well as technical studies. In addition to this, greater emphasis would be placed on the ability to work as a team rather than an individual working alone. However, despite the emphasis placed on the team and community approach in the workplace, many Americans found themselves increasingly isolated in a world that sought teamwork but also often demanded conformity. We see this in literary works like the very popular novel by J.D. Salinger, A Catcher in the Rye, which focuses on the main character's inability to find comfort or security anywhere in society, not even with his friends or his family. Of course, Salinger was not the only one who became disenchanted with the mainstream culture of mainstream white 1950s middle-class America. A counterculture of youth known as Beats, or Beatniks by their critics, would create a culture of criticism against the 1950s. Writers and artists like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac would create works that celebrated their more liberated lifestyle and harshly criticized the overly suburban, materialistic, hypocritical, and seemingly shallow lifestyle of the 1950s. The movie star James Dean personified this mentality in most of his film roles as he portrayed a dark, moody, but terrifically handsome rebellious youth aimed at living life by his own terms despite the world of conformity around him. Tragically, James Dean would die of a car accident at the age of 24. Popular music would also encapsulate the spirit of rebelliousness as the massive popularity of Elvis Presley swept the nation. Elvis sang rock and roll songs, which relied on pulsating rhythms and somewhat provocative lyrics. He also sang a style that directly ripped off African American rhythm and blues music, which had been developed, performed, and perfected by African American musicians like B.B. King, Muddy Waters, Bo Diddley, Robert Johnson, Chuck Berry, and countless others who never got half of the attention Elvis got, even though they were way better. However, the United States was and is a very racist country, so many white people wouldn't listen to rock and roll unless it was sung by a white person. Elvis was kind of the perfect white man for that job, as he had the look and ability to perform that would attract massive, predominantly white audiences. As the popularity of rock and roll grew, so did the radio's tendency to shift away from broadcasting live performances and more towards recorded studio music. The popularity of disc jockeys, or DJs, who would literally play records on the radio while providing exciting commentary between songs, also grew, but so did corruption within the industry, as radio station owners and DJs would be bribed by record producers to promote certain bands on the radio. Known as payola, these sort of bribes rocked the record industry in the late 1950s and early 1960s, but didn't hurt the record producing industry, as the sale of recorded music continued unabated until the internet came about and kind of wrecked that whole thing, sort of. But as we see towards the end of this section of the People of Plenty, there were still plenty of people who did not buy into the prosperity and homogenizing nature of 1950s America and actually turned away from it. In this next section on the other America, we'll see many people turn away from 1950s society voluntarily, but we'll also see that there were many people who were never allowed to be within 1950s culture to begin with. Taft is showing us an example of turning away from culture and doing his own thing. Aren't you, Taft? Just a rebel. Just a rebel who just does what he wants. Though the 1950s were a period of remarkable prosperity for many Americans, for a fifth of American families, that prosperity wasn't realized. Though poverty numbers were significantly better than 15 years earlier, 1960s saw nearly 30 million Americans living below the poverty line. For many white Americans, their condition of poverty was usually temporary until people within the family were able to find work. But as socialist writer Michael Harrington pointed out in his book, The Other America, there were large cross-sections of the American population who lived within what he described as a quote-unquote system designed to be impervious to hope. And when we examine the conditions faced by elderly Americans, African Americans, Latinx people, and Native Americans, that was often the case. Harrington describes these people as living in conditions of persistent poverty as people of color faced extraordinarily difficult barriers to overcome in order to escape poverty. Limited access to good-paying jobs, education, and a myriad of other barriers to success ensured that people of color would not only be poor, but remain poor. Of course, Harrington wasn't pointing out anything incredibly new, but the realization of this sad reality was news to more than a few Americans at the time. In addition to people of color and the elderly, most farmers were excluded from the affluence of the post-war period. Thanks to continued innovations in farm technology, staple crops were produced in higher numbers than ever before, thus resulting in continued declines in prices. As a result, many farmers could not make enough money to remain solvent, and many would be forced to leave their farms to try and forge a new life in more urban settings. Some larger farm owners did profit from this consolidation, but many farmers, especially sharecroppers in the South who produce cotton, found themselves in vicious cycles of poverty. Cotton farmers found their situation especially dire as new synthetic materials would further reduce the demand for cotton, thus further lowering prices as well as profits. And we see that the continued decline of one's ability to attain a reasonable quality of living in a rural setting would contribute to continued migration of rural African Americans to cities. However, blacks were not the only ones moving to the cities, as major American cities like Chicago, New York, Detroit, Cleveland, Los Angeles, and numerous other major cities would see the number of people of color expand as more and more white people began to move to the suburbs. It is during this time that the terms inner city and ghetto became synonymous with poor, non-white neighborhoods within the city. African Americans would move to the city often to escape poverty, usually in the rural South. Puerto Ricans and Mexicans would do the same, as they would seek to escape the poverty of home in order to find a better life for themselves and their families in large cities. However, they often found the ability to find gainful employment very difficult, as more and more jobs also moved out to the suburbs. Some jobs moved to countries abroad where labor was cheaper, and many jobs still practiced varying degrees of racism, whether it was blatant racism or systemic racism, in which people were unable to find work either due to economic barriers, geographical barriers, or educational barriers. As a result, many urban communities would become more and more deteriorated and impoverished, causing many to wonder how the cities became this way and what was to be done about it. Many have accepted the racist explanation that it is the fault of the cultures of those living in the city, that black and brown folks in the city simply did not have the culture or mindset to succeed. However, we see there is overwhelming evidence that blatant systems of racism played a much larger role, as racist policies in terms of housing, employment, law enforcement, government assistance, education, and city planning all caused the continued existence of racially segregated communities throughout America that all perpetuated the same experience, that the communities of people of color were significantly and blatantly lower in terms of standard of living compared to their white counterparts. To somewhat attempt to deal with this, certain quote-unquote urban renewal programs were enacted which essentially sought to demolish old buildings in order to make way for new ones. It also consisted of designing new public housing for the city's poorest residents. The result of urban renewal was either in destroying people's homes or constructing new public housing for mostly people of color, which were often poorly built and tragically designed. Predominantly black and Latinx residences of public housing projects like the Robert Taylor Homes of Chicago or the Pruitt-Igoe housing projects of St. Louis often experienced the same sort of bleak existence in which they lived in apartments built purposely to be cheap and unattractive in order to discourage people from living in public housing. However, with few educational and economic resources and an abundance of harsh and racist law enforcement policies, the experience of public housing built out of the 1950s urban renewal initiatives usually resulted in residents living bleak and uncomfortable lives, often plagued with poverty, violence, poor health, disproportionate rates of incarceration due to overly harsh and racist law enforcement practices. And in the 1950s, we see the beginnings of what we now know as the Civil Rights Movement. The 1950s would kind of be the more judicial period of the Civil Rights Movement, where huge court cases would be won, which would set precedents for later victories within the Civil Rights Movement. However, we would also see massive resistance from the white community, especially in the South, against the push for equality and equity for all Americans regardless of race. And though certain racist laws and racist policies would be struck down, the attitudes that created these racist laws and policies would remain, and the people who experience high degrees of privilege because of these laws and policies also remain. But worst of all, the people who were oppressed by these attitudes behind the laws and policies would remain oppressed as new and more subtle means of segregation and oppression would emerge in their place. The major victory for civil rights that we often most remember from the 1950s was Brown v. Board of Education, which legally ended the practice of separate but equal, which was the foundation of segregation. In this particular case, a black girl in Topeka, Kansas was forced to walk miles to her segregated elementary school, even though a white elementary school was virtually next door to her home. Thanks to the tireless efforts of skilled NAACP lawyers, the case was presented to the Supreme Court, who effectively ruled that separate but equal was unconstitutional, as in reality, separate facilities are almost never equal in terms of quality. They overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson decision and ended segregation forever. Sort of. The truth was that many politicians, administrators, and law enforcement officials would engage in quote-unquote massive resistance to integration. Some communities ignored the order of the Supreme Court, which asked communities to integrate with quote-unquote all deliberate speed. Others would invent bogus policies to maintain segregation, like pupil placement laws, which place students according to their arbitrarily determined intellectual and behavioral abilities, and some would take tax money and fund new segregation academies while defunding integrated schools. As a result, many efforts at integration resulted in full-on battles as black students faced hostile white mobs as they tried to go to school, and some would be physically barred from entering school buildings in which they were lawfully enrolled, as was the case in Little Rock, Arkansas. When 9 students tried to enter Central High School in Little Rock, a white mob was allowed to block entry by Governor Orville Faubus, a name that just screams racist Southern Jim Crow governor. With a good deal of reluctance, President Eisenhower deployed the National Guard to force students into these schools, as they would later describe incredible feelings of terror as they would face some of the worst forms of white hostility one can imagine as they went from class to class. Though anti-segregation efforts and attitudes had been marinating in the South for decades, the Brown decision was, in a lot of ways, the spark that would help launch a full-blown civil rights movement. In Montgomery, Alabama, civil rights activists saw their opportunity to effectively challenge segregation when one of their most admired and active civil rights leaders, Rosa Parks, refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a bus, which was a law at the time. Though this act is often viewed as a random act of resistance by a regular everyday person, Rosa Parks was actually a very well-regarded activist executing an action that was well calculated. Her arrest sparked outrage throughout Montgomery and would lead to a full-on boycott of the Montgomery Bus Company, which relied heavily on the patronage of black female domestic workers. The boycott was incredibly successful as it caused significant financial hardship to the company and prompted the Supreme Court to declare that segregated transportation services would be illegal. Another significant result of the Montgomery bus boycott was the emergence of a local Baptist minister to national and historic significance. Martin Luther King was asked to lead the boycott, and as a result of his efforts, his now legendary skills at leadership and oratory, he would become the most well-known national figure of the civil rights movement. Though he was somewhat reluctant to accept this leadership position, he was later consumed by it after he accepted a position as the leader of the powerful civil rights group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. His main strategy was the use of nonviolent protests, which was drawn upon the tactics used by Mohandas Gandhi against British rule in India, the writings of Henry David Thoreau, which were in reaction against U.S. policies regarding the treatment of Native Americans in Mexico in the 1800s, and also the teachings of Jesus Christ from the New Testament in the Bible. Nonviolent protests allowed civil rights activists to always gain the moral high ground as they would resist racist policies despite being arrested, abused, beaten, and sometimes killed. This strategy would prove to be effective in several ways as it would apply pressure on courts, businesses, and local governments to change their policies in the face of massive public pressure. Some may wonder why it took until the 1950s for the civil rights movement to occur. After all, ever since the failure of Reconstruction in the 1860s, African Americans had been enduring a prolonged stalemate, if not a downward spiral of worsening racism. There were several factors that contributed in various ways. One was the legacy of World War II. As African American soldiers fought for the United States, they became much more aware of the world and thus more aware of the possibility of a non-racialized life. Also, there was the idea of the double V of World War II, which meant fighting racism abroad, such as the extreme racism of Nazi Germany, as well as racism at home in the United States. Apart from soldiers, you also had many African Americans at home gaining access to better paying unionized jobs, which gave them a greater sense of awareness of the world around them, in addition to an increased expectation of better living standards. You also had more and more African Americans gaining educations and access to professional occupations like teachers, lawyers, doctors, and ministers, which helped bring more awareness and education to the black community. Media played a large role as well, as the increased prevalence of television brought images of oppression and protest to said oppression to communities that were previously remote and isolated. More people than ever before were aware of their oppression and, more importantly, that they could do something about it. And lastly, in 1950, with the United States trying to become the model country for the world, having the glaring specter of racism was simply a terrible public relations move. More people than ever before began to ask, how could the country which fancies itself as the world champion of freedom and equality, the country that vanquished fascism and Nazism, allow itself to subjugate and exploit millions of people on the basis of race? The answer was increasingly obvious the world over that it could not. Which brings us to a brief examination of the Eisenhower Administration. The Eisenhower Administration is interesting in that it was a Republican-dominated Congress as well as a Republican in the White House, which was the first time that had happened in over 20 years. But it was also interesting in that Eisenhower was the second most inexperienced president we've had in over 100 years. The most inexperienced president we've had, at least in the political sense, is Donald Trump. For reals, Taft. But despite his lack of experience, Eisenhower would prove to be a rather effective president in his ability to get policies done and to get things moving politically speaking, even if those things weren't always the best things for the nation. Eisenhower's administration in many ways reflected what General Motors CEO and Secretary of Defense Charles Wilson said when he had to defend himself against conflicts of interest. He said what's good for our country was good for General Motors and vice versa. What he meant by this was kind of the same sort of idea that Calvin Coolidge presented in the 1920s when he said the business of the United States is business. Eisenhower had a similar approach as a Republican president in that he cut back government spending and took a pro-business approach with decreased government intervention. However, he was vastly different from his 1920s predecessors in that he and other business leaders in his administration held greater acceptance towards Keynesian economic policies that involved the use of the federal government to provide a stable economy and a stable money supply. The Eisenhower administration believed in providing a stable economy by ensuring demand was consistent, that people had money to spend, and that labor relations remained friendly. We see further evidence of Eisenhower's moderate approach to policy in that he didn't really end many of the New Deal policies despite pressure from more conservative voices from his party. He increased the amount of Americans on Social Security by 10 million, increased the legal minimum wage from 75 cents to $1 an hour, and he approved the largest public works project in American history by authorizing the funding for the construction of 40,000 miles of highway. And highways are great except for the fact that when they were built through major cities, they were almost always built through poor black and brown communities, as those peoples would often lose their homes for highway construction, and the communities themselves would become further isolated from more affluent and more white communities by an actual physical barrier in a highway. Very whack. As a result of his moderate stance, as well as Adlai Stevenson's inability to generate much movement within his own campaign, Eisenhower would cruise to an even bigger landslide victory in his re-election campaign of 1956. But the Democrats would win back both the House and the Senate in 1954 and would gain even larger control of both chambers of Congress in 1958. As for Senator Joe McCarthy and his crusade against mostly non-existent subversive communist elements within the federal government, well, that came to a somewhat abrupt and tragic end during the Eisenhower administration. Though Eisenhower initially did very little to stop the McCarthy hearings, eventually McCarthy went too far as he began to go after prominent members of the armed forces. As a result, Congress organized a special investigation of the charges leveled by McCarthy, and the cross-examination of those investigations were televised. As the American public watched McCarthy try to bully witnesses, hurl false accusations, and evade issues and evidence that hurt his own position, people began to view him as a villain and a buffoon. No, Taft, not the dirtiest, smelliest ape of them all. A buffoon. In 1954, the Senate voted to censure McCarthy for conduct unbecoming of a senator. Censuring a senator means that senator has to give up his or her position on various committees. With his political career ruined, McCarthy's already heavy addiction to alcohol worsened, and it is believed to have been the cause of his premature death in 1957. And this brings us to our final section of the chapter on President Eisenhower, his Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and the Cold War. We'll see the Cold War enter a new, terrifying phase in which the threat of nuclear war seemed more possible than ever, and also we will see the United States and the Soviet Union compete with one another for a growing section of the world known as the Third World. Eisenhower's Secretary of State John Foster Dulles was an aristocratic-minded lawyer who long expressed hatred of communism. He would be a strong critic of Truman for not being harsh enough on the Soviet Union and advocated for the rollback policy of removing communism from the world rather than merely containing it. He would also champion a policy of quote-unquote massive retaliation, which was the idea of confronting the Soviets with what Dulles described as massive retaliatory power, which basically meant nuclear weapons. However, a big motivating factor behind this policy was economics, as many members of the American public, along with the Eisenhower administration, wished to curb military spending and figured out that it was way cheaper to use the threat of nuclear weapons than constantly maintain a massive mobilized army. But apart from Russia, Asia would prove to be yet another major issue for American foreign policy during the Eisenhower years, but in a different way. The issue regarding Korea had somewhat dissipated as hostilities ended within the first 2 years of Eisenhower's first term. However, a new conflict would arise in Vietnam, which at the time was a French colony. Vietnamese nationalists, led by communist leader Ho Chi Minh, began to oppose French occupation with mounting success. It became clear that without American support, France would lose control of Vietnam. Yet despite pleas from his Secretary of State and his Vice President, Eisenhower refused to intervene as he worried he would receive no support. After losing the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, French forces forces formally agreed to withdraw from Vietnam in 1954. Though America stayed out of the conflict in Vietnam initially, it would not stay out of it for long. Now, this next part gets a little bit tricky to understand in the geopolitical sense, but just try to understand this. The United States and the Soviet Union essentially tried to treat the world like a giant chessboard, with each country trying to gain better position over the other on the world. And they would try to divide up the world into simplified, perhaps reductive terms, with the United States and its industrialized capitalist allies making up the quote-unquote first world, the Soviet Union and its industrialized but communist allies making up the quote-unquote second world, and the non-industrialized, freshly decolonized rest of the world, often referred to as the third world. The control over the third world and the interventions to the various reform and revolutionary movements within it would make up what became known as various proxy wars throughout the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. We first turn our attention to Israel, whose foundation as a nation is about as complex as it gets. So we're just going to focus on this issue from an American perspective, which we get to do, as this is a lecture about American history, not world history. Israel was founded after years of exhaustive efforts by Jewish people. However, the non-Jewish Arab people that had been living there weren't happy about this, and neither were their neighbors. The United States immediately recognized Israel's establishment in 1948 and provided aid to Israel after numerous Arab countries would declare war on it throughout the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. However, Israel would cause further instability in the Middle East, which was bad because the Middle East had loads of oil which the United States and its First World allies depended on. When Iranian leader Mohammad Mossadegh began to resist First World intrusion into his oil-rich country, the United States did what it had been doing to Latin America for years. It used the CIA to engineer a revolution that overthrew Mossadegh and replaced him with a dictator for the next 25 years by the name of Shah Reza Pahlavi. Further complicating issues was Egypt. Egypt is an important country for many reasons, but especially because it houses the Suez Canal, which is a vastly important man-made waterway which conveniently connects Asia, Africa, and Europe by water. Because no one wants to have to sail all the way around Africa if they don't have to. Am I right, Taft? Dang right indeed. Well, the problem with Egypt in the 1950s was that Egypt was developing trade relations with the Soviets, which of course made the United States big mad and caused the United States to withdraw its support in the construction of the Aswan Dam across the Nile River. To retaliate, Egypt seized the Suez Canal and planned to use the profits from the canal to build the dam themselves. As a result, Israeli, French, and British forces would invade Egypt to retake the Suez Canal, despite American fears that Egypt would turn to the Soviets for help, thus potentially turning the Cold War very hot. However, the United States and the United Nations would pressure Britain, France, and Israel to back off, which they did, thus allowing the Egyptians to retain control of the Suez Canal and keeping the Cold War nice and frosty. Latin America would be yet another region ripe for Cold War conflict, particularly in the region of Cuba. You may remember from way back in an earlier lecture that Cuba had been essentially seized by the United States in the Spanish-American War and had effectively been an American colony ever since. American business essentially controlled Cuban agriculture, which predominantly made sugar for American consumers, and American organized crime syndicates controlled the hotel and nightlife businesses in the Cuban capital of Havana. Very little was left for the Cubans themselves, and by 1957 they had had enough. A popular resistance movement led by radical leftist revolutionary Fidel Castro would gain widespread support from the people until it eventually drove out dictator and American stooge Fulgencio Batista. Eisenhower would condemn the act and sever diplomatic relations with Castro. As a result, Castro would cement an alliance with the Soviet Union. The United States now had a close Soviet ally located only 90 miles away from its own border. Yet despite ongoing developments in Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, American foreign policy during Eisenhower's presidency remained focused on Europe. In 1955, Eisenhower and other NATO leaders attempted to reach an agreement with Soviet Premier Nikolai Buchanan, but after numerous efforts, no basis of agreement could be found. Adding to the tension was Hungary. Good one, Taft. Okay, fine. Here you go. The Eastern European nation of Hungary was under Soviet control by this time, but in 1956, Hungarian dissidents launched an uprising demanding democratic reforms. However, the Soviet military would brutally and decisively crush the uprising, while the United States and the West failed to intervene. Though it was a major embarrassment and disgrace for the United States and the First World, it at least kept the Cold War nice and frigid. But another effort at peace between the US and the Soviets proved fruitless with the U-2 crisis. Hey Taft, do you like U-2? Yeah, they got that one song that's on the radio. I forget the name of it though. Yeah. Newly appointed Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev had agreed to meet with President Eisenhower to discuss potential peace terms, but those talks were effectively destroyed when an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Russian territory. Outraged that Americans were spying on his country as it was negotiating for peace, Khrushchev suspended all talks and hostilities between the United States and Russia continued on. During his 8 years in office, Eisenhower exercised a great deal of restraint and would leave office with a warning of what could happen should the United States allow itself to be influenced by what Eisenhower described as the quote-unquote vast military-industrial complex. What he meant by this was that the United States had a lot of people that wanted a war and stood to make a lot of money off of a war, and the United States therefore had to be very careful. Eisenhower was sure careful as he avoided conflicts in Europe, the Middle East, Latin America, and Vietnam. His successors, however, would not do the same. And next week, we'll look at the 1960s where everything was fine, everything was normal, and nobody challenged the status quo in terms of how government, society, and culture worked in the United States. Not. As always, on behalf of myself and William Howard Taft, thank you guys so much for watching, and don't forget, you gotta keep pushing, G.